Hello guys, this is Kay from Pod Rainbow Science, and in today's episode I'm gonna talk about bisexual man. Here we go! Hello guys, once again, I hope you're doing great today, and I'm doing alright, and I have some good news. I'm having a job interview tomorrow. I applied for an assistant position at the medical college, so if they accept me for this position, I'll be working as a researcher, statistician, and an academic teacher. So, keep your fingers crossed and we'll see how this is gonna work. And I'll, of course, give you an update next time. But now, let's talk about those mystical creatures everybody's heard about, but few have seen. Bisexual man. I'm in the middle of the analysis process of the data that includes LGBT sample, and I came across the same problem as usual, and I'm talking about unequal sample size. If you are a researcher, you are perfectly aware what I'm talking about. And having equal sample size is quite important. The sample size, they don't have to be super equal, so you don't have to compare 42 people with exactly 42 people and no deviations allowed. It's not like this. But you can easily imagine that comparing group of, for example, 300 people with a group of 4 people wouldn't work. Such analysis just makes no sense. And I always have a problem when I have to compare people in terms of their sexual identity. There are usually a lot of straight men, of course, a lot of gay men, and almost no bisexual men. And it's the recurring problem. Bisexual men in our sample are usually far and few between. And on the contrary, there is no problem with bisexual women. Bisexual women and homosexual women are comparable in amount. And women of other identifications like pansexual and demisexual are less numerous, but we expect it. But bisexual men are always insufficient to apply the proper analysis, so we have to combine them with homosexual men, which is of course not the most optimal solution because we're losing the subtle difference between them. So if we conduct the analysis, we usually have straight women, gay women or lesbians, and bisexual women, and then we have straight men and non-straight men. That's it. So I was tossing and turning, thinking about bisexual men, and I just realized how weird it may sound to you. But anyway, I was tossing and turning in my bed, thinking of how to deal with this issue, and I had a flashback of the publication I read a few months ago, so I decided to grab a microphone and tell you something about it today, or actually tonight, because it's the middle of the night right now. But the publication I want to talk about was published in 2020, and it was authored by 13 researchers from Essex University, Pennsylvania State University, University of Chicago, American Institute of Bisexuality, Northwestern University, so many good and recognized institutions. And in the first sentence of the abstract, the authors write, quote, "The question whether some men have a bisexual orientation, that is, whether they are substantially sexually aroused and attracted to both sexes, has remained controversial among both scientists and laypersons. Skeptics believe that male sexual orientation can only be homosexual or heterosexual, and that bisexual identification reflects non-sexual concerns such as desire to de-emphasize homosexuality." End of quote. And yes, for a very long time, that was the bottom line of the narration about bisexual men. People who believe that men can be either homosexual or heterosexual and nothing between usually accuse those men who identified as bi that they are not confident enough to claim that they were gays. Or they were sitting on a fence and they want to stay in this socially convenient position. So on one hand, they want to have sex with men, so they fulfill this homosexual part of them. But on the other hand, they don't want to experience all that stigma-related shit, so they remain at least a little straight. Well, the overall effect was that, and it is still very visible in research, that bisexual men and bisexual people in general are stigmatized in both heterosexual and homosexual group because they're always not enough. Not enough gay, not enough straight, and especially bisexual men are in a pretty bad position. But to understand it, we have to take a step back, or even a few steps back, to the very early research conducted by Alfred Kinsey. One of the most famous researcher of human sexuality, the author of Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, published in 1948, and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, published in 1953. These two works, published some time before the sexual revolution, definitely they were definitely a revolution. They changed the way of thinking about human sexuality and definitely caused that tsunami of criticism toward Kinsey and his team. And if you want to know more about him, watch the movie entitled Kinsey with Liam Neeson and Laura Linney. It's not the best, but not the worst movie. So that you can get familiar with the idea that what was going on and how he started his research. But the point I'm trying to get to is male sexuality in his studies. We can, from our contemporary perspective, criticize him for many reasons, for his research methodology, for his concept formation, for many other reasons, but it must be admitted that he did this first step and enabled studies on sexuality for those who came after him. And in Sexual Behavior in Human Male, he wrote, quote, "Males do not represent two discrete populations, heterosexual and homosexual. The world is not divided into sheep and goats. Not all things are black, nor all things are white. It is a fundament of human taxonomy that nature rarely deals with discrete categories. Only the human mind invents categories and tries to force facts into separated pigeonholes. The living world is a continuum in each and every one of its aspects." End of quote. And that is how Kinsey understood human sexuality. He believed that heterosexuality is at one point, at one end of the rainbow, but on the other end, there is homosexuality, and it is rare that people stay on the very end for their whole life. So to better capture human sexuality, Kinsey created a scale, and you can find it, you still find it on the internet when you look up Kinsey scale, just like his last name and the scale. And the scale is still used by some researchers. However, we usually base on the self-reported identity. So we just ask people how they define themselves. Because, it's more important for us. But sometimes the Kinsey scale is used as some additional measure. The scale is very easy to use. It ranges from 0 to 6. And 0 means that you are absolutely exclusively heterosexual. 1 means predominantly heterosexual, only incidentally homosexual. 2 means predominantly heterosexual, but more than incidentally homosexual. 3 is equally heterosexual and homosexual, so we could say it's pure bisexuality if you position yourself on 3, it means that you are 50-50. And 3 is, of course, the middle of the scale. And next, if you are 4, it means that you are predominantly homosexual, but more than incidentally heterosexual. 5 means homosexual, only incidentally heterosexual. And finally, 6 means that exclusively homosexual. So like 100% gay. The problem with this scale is that it is based on sexual behavior. And the behavior itself wouldn't be so problematic yet, but the greater problem is that it's not always explicit. And also it is not very precise, because, what's the difference between number 2, incidentally homosexual, and number 3, more than incidentally homosexual? It depends very much on who's asked, right? So for me, for example, 10 heterosexual contacts and 3 homosexual would fit the category only incidentally homosexual, but for you it could fit the category more than incidentally homosexual. So it's not precise, and if it hinges on individual's perspective so much, it's way easier to just ask people how they define themselves, just like this. And by the way, if you think of people's behavior, not many people can place themselves either on 0 or on 6. Literally, even the gayest person on earth had a moment of slight attraction to a person of other gender. And many straight people had emotional or somewhat sexual experience with persons of their own gender. So it's not even possible to capture human sexuality with one category. And if you want to know more about scales of human sexuality, you can also look up something that is called the Klein Sexual Orientation Grid. And I'm going to upload the link to this one in the description of the episode. It's a kind of extension of Kinsey scale. It includes past sexual experience, present and future. And it also includes sexual behavior, sexual attraction, fantasies, and so on. And if you have a few minutes, you can play around with it a little bit. Okay, but what's with this Kinsey? Although it doesn't surprise us that many people would place themselves somewhere in between heterosexuality and homosexuality, and still they wouldn't identify as bisexual. The fact is that when researchers use this scale in their work, men had a tendency to identify it as 0 or 1 or 5 and 6 rather than 2, 3 or 4. And on the contrary, women presented more centralized tendency, so they placed themselves as 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 and less often 0 or 6. And for a long time it supported the social belief that all women are bisexual, to some extent at least, and men are either straight or gay. And the reason for this is not clear. I would lean more toward the social explanation, that women are socially more open toward their attraction, and it is less socially accepted for men to admit that they are attracted to other men, even if there's not the faintest sexual context. Right, so women can say that other women looks great and sexy, and that would be perfectly normal. But when you hear a man saying the same thing about other men, the reactions would be utterly different, and almost automatically triggers the sexual connotation. So it doesn't surprise me that much that studies reflect this phenomenon, but I don't know it for sure. So this is only my hypothesis. So let's leave my hypothesis and my thoughts behind and take a look at the paper I have in front of my eyes. The authors refer to a few hypotheses about male bisexuality, and they mention about early sex researchers such as Kraft-Ebing and Hirschfeld, who believed that bisexual men act on heterosexual behavior for reasons other than bisexual orientation. That is due to social pressure. So that is what I mentioned before. The commonly shared belief that bisexual men are gay men who are afraid to come out completely. And next, they dwell on the social situation of bisexual men who are often considered as unable to commit, promiscuous, and so on. Like all bisexual people swing from chandelier, have hundreds of sexual partners, and carry all the STIs around. And that's also the reason why years ago bisexual men were accused of passing HIV on to women, because it was believed that they had many male partners and then went to have sex with women. So you can see there were many hurtful misunderstandings about bisexuality, and it is gonna take years to clear it all up. However, as I already told you, that self-reporting methods can be questioned and they are prone to social influence, more robust and more valid methods were needed to support the hypothesis that bisexual men do exist. And what could be more valid than physical measures? Or I'd better say physiological measures. And here comes the penile plethysmography. The penile plethysmography, also called PPG or penile sexual arousal test, is a method that is the method to measure sexual arousal in people who have penis. So usually it is used to measure men. The procedure itself is without doubt invasive to individuals' privacy. But it seems to be more objective than self-reporting methods, of course. So, it's a kind of trade-off. And because it is believed that PPG cannot be manipulated so easy. I guess it's not entirely impossible, but it's hard to do. The penile plethysmography method is often used in criminal cases to check whether the person does or does not respond sexually to children, so it's used mostly when a person is accused of child abuse. And the procedure isn't very complicated. The test participant applies the device on their penis. It is, it's something like a cuff they put on their penis, and it's measuring blood flow to the penis. And for those of you who don't know how it works, the more blood is flowing to the penis, the greater erection it causes. And the greater erection, the greater sexual arousal. And the measure is, this measure is quite sensitive, so the whole procedure is based on a stimuli presentation. Like for example, the picture of a naked person can be a stimulus, and a penile reaction is recorded. And you can imagine that if someone doesn't strike us as sexually interesting, we wouldn't react anyhow, or at least we wouldn't react as much as we would if someone is interesting for us. And that's the whole idea. Women also can be measured. The blood flow to the vagina can be also recorded, and it is called the vaginal plethysmography. You can Google it. There are pictures of this device. It works more or less, in case of women, it works more or less the same way. But in this particular study, they used, for example, videos of sexual interactions between actors or solitary actors masturbating, and of course several neutral stimuli such as footage of landscapes, things like that. They did not use the videos with sexual intercourse of, let's say, heterosexual couples. So they were either male-male couple or female-female couple, or solitary actors. That data was collected over the course of almost 20 years, from 2000 to 2019, and overall 606 male participants took part in the study. The whole idea, and of course I'm simplifying it right now, but the whole idea was to compare the self-reported Kinsey scale with the genital reported Kinsey scale. I mean, they try to compare the self-reported sexual identity with genital response to the stimuli. The results, especially the figure that is included in the paper, shows clearly that genital arousal correlates with self-reported Kinsey scale, and the correlation was roughly 0.84, so it's a very strong correlation. And men who declared being monosexual, so those who identified as 0 or 6, showed greater mean difference in arousal to male and female stimuli compared to those men who identified from 1 to 5 on the Kinsey scale. To put it in simple words, for men who identified as heterosexual, male stimuli were less arousing, and for those who identified as homosexual, female stimuli were less arousing. And consequently, for those men who identified as bisexual, patterns for sexual arousal were like this. Their reactions to female stimuli were higher compared to homosexual men and lower compared to heterosexual men. And the reactions to male stimuli were on average higher compared to heterosexual men and lower than homosexual men. And of course, this study, or actually the series of smaller studies, because they regarded as a few studies combined, it is not free from limitations. First, participants were volunteers, so it is always the question whether the sample is representative or not, and the answer in this case should be it is not. We don't have the representative sample of all bisexual men, and to have them we should have a database of all bisexual men, like literally all bisexual men from all around the world, and at random pick a few thousands of them and invite them to participate in our study. It is virtually impossible. It's, just undoable. So we have to accept it as some kind of limitation, but including several smaller studies and accordingly several samples of bisexual men, it helps to alleviate this limitation. However, so far, this particular study shows the most extensive and the most systematic, the most extensive and systematic analysis of arousal patterns in bisexual men. And the results seems to support the hypothesis that they indeed do exist. The publication itself drew a visible attention in scientific community and gained, of course, a lot of comments. But, many people were sharing it on Twitter and on ResearchGate and on Facebook and in other places. And what's related to this, it also gained several critics and comments. So, for instance, Brendan Zich and Morgan Sidari questioned the use of Kinsey scale as a measure of sexuality. In the letter they stated that, quote, "The main problem with the Kinsey scale is that it conflates two distinct constructs. Degree of sexual attraction behavior toward opposite sex. Others, the opposite sex others persons, and degree of sexual attraction behavior towards same-sex others. These two constructs are put in opposition to each other to yield a single number, such that a higher score on homosexual interests necessarily equates to a lower score on heterosexual interests. This forced trade-off would not be a problem if heterosexual and homosexual interests were in reality perfectly inversely related, and hence opposite ends of a single continuum." End of quote. And of course, I agree with their statement, and I agree, and most of all, Kinsey would agree, that sticking to this binary vision of human sexuality must end up with an oversimplified understanding. However, as scientists, we have to sometimes, at least, agree to that kind of trade-off. Otherwise, it would be impossible to conduct quantitative research. And this agreement must come at the cost of diversity. But, to date, no one has found, figured out how to overcome it. So for some reason, we have to simplify the reality to be able to conduct research. And that's it. Another allegation was related to reducing bisexuality to sexual arousal, which is that sexual arousal rooted in binary-oriented norms, and additionally bisexual identity can also be adopted by someone who is not sexually active. And it is true, of course, but I wouldn't see it as the limitation of the study. I would rather say that this is just one side of the coin. It's just one of many ways to describe it and operationalize bisexuality. And as Kinsey has written, and I would agree with this one also, human sexuality is a complex issue, and our binary understanding of genders, our one-dimension scale of sexual orientation, and our understanding of relationships as two persons union is by definition limiting. And it is changing along with our increasing knowledge on sexuality. So we do our best to implement all that we know about human sexual and sexual identity and gender identity and relationship diversity and so on, but it's gonna take some time to provide better measures and more valid methods. Thus, we are open to new ideas and new approach to conduct better quality research, but as I'm saying, it's gonna take some time. And this one study I was referring to might not be the best one, and it is absolutely not the best one, but it definitely presents the new approach and adds to the existing knowledge on male bisexuality. And just to wrap up this lengthy episode, I just want to say that whenever someone casts a doubt on your bisexual identity, or maybe you were the one who did not believe in bisexuality, you can study this paper. I will, of course, upload the link to this study in the episode description. So read it, study, take a closer look at the figures and at the raw data. And of course, if you have questions, you can write me a message on Twitter or send me an email. I'll be happy to help. And of course, as usual, thank you very much for being with me today, and hope to have you here next time. So take care and goodbye.